Interamna Lirenas is the site that the Faculty of Classics and staff and students have been working on now for 10 years. Now, what you see here is quite a promising slide. It shows you that we've been very busy, and what you're looking at is basically a theater and a few other structures around it. We are looking at what was once the Forum. However, if you look at the site when we started, you'll see absolutely nothing, which is the reason why actually we were allowed to start this project, because it looked so underwhelming and so unpromising that nobody cared whether we were working there or not. So what we did there was basically to recognize that we knew there was a Roman town. There must have been something there, because when they were plowing, a lot of things came to the surface. It's usually a good sign that something is buried underneath, but nothing structural, no structure, no wall was really sticking from the ground. Where are we, just to give you a sense? We are in between Rome and the Gulf of Naples. So we are in the very center of an area that in the Roman period, in ancient times more generally, was highly densely occupied and populated. Interamna was supposed to be a Roman town. We read about it in Livy and several other authors, not as a very important one, but a name that recurs from time to time. It was founded apparently in 312 BC as a colony, and it was supposed to be a stronghold against the Samnites. A very long history, apparently, because some inscriptions that have been found, mostly in the courtyards of farms nearby, taken from the site a long, long time ago, suggest that this town was still active in the late antique period, so as far as late as the early 400s AD. So what happened and why did this appear? A general opinion when we started is that this was not really a town. This was a town only by name. It was a big village that everyone was convinced was a big failure, and that's the reason why we couldn't see anything. So what we did is that we took our students, we trained them in the use of the magnetometer, and which is this weird tool you see here, which is basically able to detect slight variations in the magnetic field of the subsoil, and we'll be able to tell if there is something that is totally different from the soil surrounding it, like a wall, for example, like a structure. We did that. We did georadar as well with colleagues from the University of Ghent in Belgium, and the principles of the georadar are basically the same of any other radar, with the difference that rather than casting signals in the air in the sky, he sends it underground and is able to detect anomalies. That is something that is strange compared to the context in which they're inserted. So again, structure within the soil. That allows us to find what? Well, that there was indeed a Roman town underneath. This slide may not be quite clear, but if we zoom in, you can tell that what we've been able to identify is plenty of structures, walls, that with a long and painstaking analysis, we could identify as belonging to houses, basilica, the theater before it was excavated, several houses, the forum, and so on. This on the entire surface of this town, which is about 25 hectares. Now, we not only been able to identify individual units within the town, but we've been able to identify their function. That allows us to show what? Well, basically that it had its own share of public buildings, not just the theater, but several others that you see in green, in blue, 3 baths, not just one, but 3, one especially large one, several intramural sanctuaries, there are temples, and a wide array of houses, of domestic spaces. And like you would expect in a Roman town, as the situation that you, for example, would find in Pompeii, houses of large size and therefore presumably of a higher status basically show up interspersed with houses of a smaller size and therefore smaller status. This is typical of Roman towns, something I was teaching this morning as it happens, in which members of what we refer to as different classes do in fact live next to each other, because their social relationship are mediated through the relationship of patronage. So, members of what we would refer to as the higher classes were in fact interested in being surrounded by their own clientes, within their own neighborhoods. And this situation that we find and we know from better known examples like Pompeii, well, we've identified here. All of this without excavating, really, which is what is really good about it, as it saves a lot of time and effort. But we did our own excavation, and originally we concentrated on the theater. Why the theater? Because if you have ever visited any theater in any ancient site, you will notice immediately there is something weird. That is, the semicircular plan, typical of any theater, has been cut in order to be, fitted inside what looks like a rectangular building. The reason for that, and you can see that now that we've excavated it, this is the entire plan as brought to light by 10 years and several generations of work and several generations of students. Well, this was not just a theater, but we believe it was in fact a roofed theater. And the reason why it was cut by a rectangular building is that it was contained in it and covered with a roof. This is confirmed by other elements, like, for example, the lack of a system for the drainage of water that a structure like this would have necessarily collected had it been open air, as it is the case with all the other open air theaters. They tend to have a system of drain for the drainage of water. This one didn't. And in fact, we found all around the building, and you can see here, gutters for the collection of the water coming down from the roof. Now, this is quite rare. There are about 100 theaters, ancient theaters, Greek and Roman, that are known from peninsular Italy. And basically, there are about 10 that we think may have had a roof, and this is one of those. It seems to suggest that the people of Interamna, this Roman town, wanted to have something special, a kind of the last in architectural fashion at the time in which they built, which is around the time of Augustus, so the first emperor. What is it that this town? Is there anything special about this town? Well, no, that's the point. Was probably an average Roman town, and everything that you're gonna hear today probably applies to many other towns that are not as well documented. And indeed, until we started doing our work, this town was not very well known, was not that well documented. So one thing that we discovered, because we were quite puzzled by the fact that nothing was standing, everyone was assuming this to be a settlement of secondary importance, has to do with a nice little inscription that you see here as reported in the collection, the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, which is the catalog of all known Latin inscription, and was seen in fragmentary form by different people at different time and increasingly less clearly. Well, we started doing our own thing, and we found an interesting cadastral map from the early 1800s that basically told us, well, preserved the entire text of the inscription and the little piece of information that Julius Caesar was the patronus of this town. Now, interestingly, people may think, well, that is the sign that this was no ordinary town. Well, actually, probably it was. It is telling you that, in fact, the political network in Rome extended very thoroughly throughout Italy, even to include and establish a political relationship with what was basically not a very important town, but just a center within its regions. We know of other towns that were bestowed with the same privilege, and they are not very important as well. When you consider that mostly this situation, this patronage from a very important person in Rome is attested by one inscription, you understand the randomness in this kind of documentation and the fact that probably many others shared this aspect with Interamna. We know that it was, indeed, we know even the date in which it was basically a patronus of the colony, a couple of years before his own death. Why, I told you it was an ordinary town in many respects. It's not very large. It's way smaller than, for example, Pompeii would be. where did he get its wealth? Because clearly there were not only a lot of people, but people who invested in it, in building monuments like any other Roman town. What was its wealth? Where it came from? Well, we know that it was part of two at least networks of periodical markets. And we know that because Interamna features in two different lists. So the Roman, we find inscriptions that list towns that were part of the same network of markets, like say, on different days, the same kind of market will move around different communities. And Interamna seems to appear on two networks that did not overlap, except for Interamna. So basically, it was a hub for, trade. And this seems to confirm to us by the fact that you see here highlighted in yellow, a series of buildings that we understood as horea, that is warehouses. There is a strangely high number of these buildings in this town, more than probably were needed, certainly more than we know from many other cities. I mean, not including Ostia, which was the port of Rome. What does this mean? Is that probably this town needed space to stock goods and whatever that needed to be distributed somewhere else. It was part of a network of redistribution, and the people in Interamna made money probably out of that. Why and where they were redistributing? Well, we are immediately outside of the town, near the river Liri, and which gives the name to the town. Lirenas mean in the Liri Valley. And here again, geophysical prospection, georadar in this case, were able to identify what? Warehouses next to the river is here, which was navigable in antiquity. And what we have here, apart from what is likely to be a bath complex, is warehouses and a nice temple. This is the river port on Interamna. And this was basically what linked Interamna to the rest of central Italy and beyond, because through the Liri, through the river, it got to the port of Minturnae, and from there to the rest of the Mediterranean. So what you have here is what we've been able to uncover here is the story of a middling, average, not very remarkable Roman town that, however, features all the elements that we know about from other better documented places. And the explanation for this is due to its place, its role within that growing network of cities and towns across the Roman world, which basically made it possible for the Roman civilization to exist the way we've come to learn about it. Now, this project, as I said, is run together with, is run basically by our students with a little of kind of supervision from people like me. And that is why I would like to pass to you to two of our students. One is an undergraduate, is Alfred Deahl. He will tell you about his work on coinage and the work that he's been doing as part of his undergraduate dissertation this year. The other one is one of our PhD student, Dominique Goddard, who is the deputy director, field director for this project, who's been working now on a different range of materials from the site and elsewhere, but who did undergraduate dissertation on the sundial that we found there. So, Alfred, to you.
Hi, just get screen share up. Here we go. Can you all see that? Right, so hi, I'm Alfred. I've been cleaning the coins and identifying them at Interamna over the past 2 seasons, and today I thought to show what I've been doing. The body of coins I've been identifying includes about 70 coins found over the last decade of fieldwork. They're all copper alloy, with the exception of this lovely late Republican denarius. You can see the moneyer's name, Regulus, on the reverse side, underneath his bucket of corn. The cleaning process largely consists of removing the encrusted dirt with a fiberglass pencil from the surface of the coin. Fiberglass doesn't scratch the metal, so it enables us to sort of record enough information to then compare it to the catalogues to sort of identify the precise type. Through this, the numismatic profile of the site can be built up, which hopefully will be useful one day comparing it to nearby sites. So one of the largest clusters of coins from a particular period is the Augustan coinage at the site, which is particularly prominent because this was sort of a large building phase on the site, so it's sort of what we would expect. Many of these coins appear pretty battered, but we are still able to get sort of a lot of information from them. So for instance, this specific type, we can construct the legend completely and work out the precise type. You know that Mycelius Tullus was the moneyer who oversaw the production of this coin in 7 BC. So we have the precise date, and that's useful information which can help dating. So amongst all the coin finds so far, this particular coin type has stood out as being unusual. Here we have a Syracusan coin struck in the last quarter of the 3rd century BC. The obverse, the front, shows a typically Greek design. It's bearded Zeus, and the reverse shows a Bega, the 2-horse chariot, with Victory, with Nike driving it. In this, the bodies are sort of shape of a 5, and you can just make out the wing. The legend saying it was from Syracuse is largely eroded away and would have been beneath the horse. So one of the sort of major questions of my dissertation is sort of to answer why we have this Syracusan coin all the way at Interamna. To answer this question, we need to contextualize what's going on more broadly in the coinage of Italy in this period. This is a major era of transition where Roman coinage, the coinage produced in Rome, gradually supplants and replaces the other coinages of the peninsula. Italy is inherently multipolar, which manifests numismatically in a very diverse patchwork of coinages with all these little states producing their own. Naples is sort of the dominant producer until that's replaced by Rome. Interamna never produced its own coinage, unlike some of the other colonies, but it seems because its proximity to Campania to have used this sort of commonly circulating coinage of the sort of all the different towns in that area. As coinage increasingly became desirable from an economic perspective, the demand for it was met most through reuse of what we might call a foreign currency, especially when formal production couldn't supply the demand. Formal production is quite difficult to actually carry out because it requires a regular source of metal and a lot of technology in the production process, and also the skilled artisans need to cut the dies. It requires a lot of skill. So we see needs for currency being met through essentially just using other coinage from the era. So this seems to be an informal measure to meet the currency needs in the context of an inadequate supply, which was certainly made worse by the disruptions in the Second Punic War. We find this trend more regionally as well. So sort of down the road, just to the south of Interamna, like sort of about 20 kilometers away, we have Minturni, and they're famous numismatically for these Neapolitan chopped bronzes, which is a very curious issue where they seem to counter-strike coins from Naples just simply with a hammer and chisel. Very basic, very crude, but it seems to, in their own way, make this coinage their own. We see a sort of a more formalized way of appropriating other coinage with what we call pseudo-mints. So at Pompeii, for instance, we find them actually trying to produce imitation coins from Ebusus, which is modern day Ibiza. But that's the sort of that's meeting need at its most formal, and at Interamna it seems to be the sort of most informal and common method of dealing with a currency deficiency, which is just reusing the foreign coinage. This trend, however, doesn't last for long. The Roman mint is eventually able to catch up and produce enough to the point that all the regional coinages of Italy are totally displaced. And you just have the sort of one unified coinage of the peninsula. So we start finding Second Punic War, from the Second Punic War onwards, this kind of coinage at Interamna, which is sort of very noticeably Roman. The reverse type, you can just about make out a ship's prow, and below there's a legend Roma, which makes it very clear where it was produced. So the oldest coins in generally are archaeologically very rare. However, I hope in coming seasons, especially as we reach sort of older Republican layers, we get a better picture of this way Interamna informally integrated itself into the broader, diverse currency system of the Italian Peninsula. Thank you very much. Domi, I'm very happy to pass over to you now.
Wonderful. I'm just sharing my screen. Okay, thank you so much, Alfred, and thank you, Alessandro, for the brief introduction earlier. As Alessandro mentioned, I'm a PhD student, but during my undergraduate, I wrote about the sundial, which it pains me to say, I think my thesis is the least read work on this sundial, because the story of its discovery was actually picked up everywhere, much to our delight, from the BBC to the National Geographic. So a really kind of thrilling and exciting discovery for all involved. In this very brief presentation, I want to explain a little bit more about how this device worked, and also what it can tell us about the town and how it fits back into the narrative of Interamna that Alessandro and Alfred have already started to lay out for us. So the discovery happened in the summer of 2017, where I have to admit that I was quite literally sitting on this find for several days before we finally turned it over and realized that it wasn't just an unusually cut block of limestone, but it was actually a Roman conical sundial, which is a name given to sundials of this particular shape, which might not be particularly familiar to many of you here who might be more used to kind of medieval sundials, which are often painted on buildings or kind of flat on plates. And to give you an idea of how rare this is or how common this object is, sundials were quite the rage across Italy, especially from the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. Huge amounts were dedicated, and we have about 160 sundials, all in various states of preservation from the whole of Roman Italy. However, the amount of conical sundials is obviously a lot less, and what makes this sundial really quite special is its double inscription, which we'll come to later, which names the benefactor. And this makes it just 1 out of 3 sundials in Italy, which have a Latin inscription mentioning the person who set it up. So really, really exciting from that point of view. Before we go on to look at the inscription and the object itself, I wanted to take you through how this works. And in order to do that, we need to understand how Roman time worked, because the hours are a little bit more complicated than our modern day hours. So rather than having set hours of 60 minutes, I'll play this in a moment, otherwise it will make you all dizzy. The Roman hours actually varied from about 40 minutes to 80 minutes, depending on the season. So how on earth did they calculate them? What they basically did is they got the amount of daylight time and they divided it equally into 12 parts. So that means that in the summer, when the days are really long, these equal parts of the daylight time were probably around 80 minutes. So their hours, their daytime hours, were much, much longer in the summer than they were in the winter, where the much shorter days were broken into 12 parts, and these parts would be much, much smaller. So if I play this video for a moment, you can see that the daylight hours, which are the white ones at the bottom, become shorter in winter and longer in summer. I'll stop playing it now before you all get dizzy. The Romans themselves play with this idea of various hours. We get some characters, for example, in one of Plautus's comedies, and one says to the other, "Hey, I bet you can't finish this barrel of wine in under an hour." And the second character replies, "I can do it, not just in a summer's hour, so 80 minutes, but I can even get it down in a winter's hour. So it's going to take me half the time that you think I can finish it in. So how did these conical sundials actually work? Now, when we look more closely at our sundial from Interamna, you'll notice that an essential part is missing. This part is the gnomon, which you can see here in the middle, essentially a kind of metal spike that stuck out horizontally and needed to face south in order for the sundial to work properly. When the sun rose in the east, it cast a shadow across, the gnomon shadow fell to the left side of the dial. And as the sun rose into the sky, the gnomon shadow traced across the face of the dial to point directly kind of downwards. And then as the sun set in the west, the shadow would move across the face to the right side. And as you can see, the dial is split into 12 different parts to mark the 12 hours of the day. It's possible that these dials are also used slightly to show the winter and the summer solstice. So you can see it's marked on here, and the shadow would have been shorter in the winter than it was in the summer. But a lot of them aren't particularly accurate. So this probably wasn't their kind of primary goal. Also, you would have hoped that people would have known whether it was winter or summer without looking at a sundial. So obviously, in order for these devices to work and to do their job of telling the time, there needed to be some sunlight. But more than that, probably they also needed to be in a wide area and elevated in order to be visible and also to not fall in the shadow of any surrounding buildings. So it's for this reason that we think that the original place of the sundial may have been in the forum at Interamna, a large space, and it may have been elevated on a column. Supporting this is actually the fact that if we look at our Interamna sundial on the left here, you can't see the first inscription, which is across this curve. And that's because it was much more visible if you were standing underneath it than if you were looking straight at it. We can also imagine that these might have been colored to help them better stand out. As you can see, there are very small remains of the metal gnomon, which we would imagine would stick out like this in order to give a reading. Now, looking at these, and for anyone who's tried to read a sundial in general, these are not about precision, or at least they're not trying to give a modern sense of precision. I'm sure you were all counting down the seconds before this webinar started, but these kinds of devices didn't allow to be precise to the nearest minute. They probably give you a pretty good half hour or 15-minute reading. So we can imagine a lot of hanging around in the Roman world, waiting for your date or waiting for your business meeting, because 6 o'clock to someone wasn't necessarily 6 o'clock for the other. Now, precision in timekeeping sometimes was important in the Roman world, and for that you can imagine the use of water clocks. For example, we know that in law courts, in order to give both sides a kind of equal and fair say, water clocks, kind of similar to egg timers, might have been used. There's an excellent quip by Marshall, who is getting really bored by one of the speakers, and he urges him to please kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Take a sip from your water clock. In doing so, you'll quench your own thirst and help your own voice, but you'll also save your audience by minimizing the amount of time that you have left to speak. So I hope none of you are thinking that I should be drinking from my own water clock at the moment. I have provided this image so that we can better see the upper inscription. And as we said before, I actually do need to drink now, so I'm going to drink from my own water clock. It names the benefactor, who we can read here as Marcus Novius Tubula, and it also tells us who his father was, so son of Marcus. It also wonderfully gives his political status. So he is a tribune of the plebs, and he set this monument up from his own purse. So he's funded it himself. Now, this has been dated to the end of the 1st century BC, start of the 1st century AD, and this makes the office of plebeian tribune particularly interesting, because this, at this point in time, was an office that was held specifically in Rome. But this monument was set up in Interamna, and it looks like, from the presence of another inscription with a similar name, that this guy was probably a local. So what was happening here? It looks like probably this local guy had gone to Rome, made it big in politics, and had set up a monument in his hometown to boast about it and to celebrate. So how does that link back in with the with Alessandro and Alfred's points about this being in some ways a kind of unremarkable town, which was essentially part of a wider network? Well, here we have a very specific of an individual making the most of this network. Number one, we have him traveling between Rome and his hometown and trying to keep this kind of link alive. And number two, we have him drawing on a much wider tradition and a much wider trend of timekeeping that infected not only Rome and Interamna, but a huge amount of other Italian cities at this time. In this way, I think we can see what is for us definitely a really remarkable object, kind of demonstrating the lack of remarkability in some ways that this town actually embodied. So just to wrap up, I wanted to leave you with a modern day analogy of looking at your phone, or when you look at your watch face, you often see a kind of brand name pop out at you. And this is an incredible advertisement that has its roots right back in Petronius's Satyricon, when Trimalchio commands that they should place a sundial in the middle of his tomb. He's talking about his tomb here, so that anyone who looks at the time, like it or not, well it, nol it, will read my name. So I hope you all agree that this is a very interesting way of looking at this sundial, and that the residents not only of Rome and Interamna, but even all of us looking at this sundial on the computer screen today can see Tubula's name enduring, and even now we still, like it or not, still read his name. I will now pass on to James to field any questions you have.
Thank you, everybody. So I think this is wonderful, seeing both the kind of work that the faculty is engaged in, but also the way in which these kinds of projects can generate work that undergraduates can do for their undergraduate theses, and it can work all the way through into postgraduate research work. So it's a good sort of illustration of the way in which the kind of vertical relationships in the faculty work. So if anyone has any questions, please do continue to drop them into the Q&A box, and I'll pass them on to our panellists. Can I ask, while people are kind of thinking on that, can I ask perhaps Alessandro, or whoever wants to come in, what difference this excavation has made to the modern inhabitants of the local town, and what they think about you driving strange machines up and down their fields and then telling them about these people that were there 2,000 years ago?
It has made an enormous amount of difference to them, partly because when we started, they really were against archaeology. I mean, all this land is private. And despite it looks like a, if I can share the image of the site, you can tell it feels like it may be a bit of a garden, if you like, well kept and whatever. But agriculture is not very feasible as an economic activity in the area. So what they want to do is to build. But since the 70s, because they thought there was something there was something preventing there, a law preventing them from building. So when we arrived, they said, oh, finally someone is coming to show that there is nothing here. And basically, they were very welcoming, precisely because they hoped that we would have not found anything. They told me stories that when they plowed, they got something caught in the plow, and sometimes that did damage. So they got their vengeance on whatever was buried underneath by bringing a bigger plow to destroy whatever was there. And there is this anecdote that I always retell about this story, which is there was a farmer who basically it was the one who had destroyed something with his plow. And when we opened our very small trench, our very first one, he came in the evening to visit us, and I showed him that not only there were walls, but actually you could see on the walls the scratch of the plow. And the guy started crying and saying, "Oh my God, what have I done?" And I said, "Don't worry. I mean, now that you know it, you can." And from the moment onwards, attitude among the town kind of changed, because all of a sudden they could see things that for a long time they were told were there, but in fact they never believed, because also archaeologists are told them, yes, there is something, but it's not very important. So they have started to develop a sense of pride for their town, because they also, the story that was told of this, like many other settlements of this kind, is that this was a military colony. It was established at the time of military conquest. The problem is that the Romans were too successful, and by the time this town had been established, the front had already got to the tip of southern Italy, so they were irrelevant. They found themselves to be irrelevant, and that doesn't make for a nice story to tell. Whereas on the other hand, to show that these people actually managed to adapt to new conditions, to make the most of all their position within central Italy, kind of fill these people with pride, take into account that at some point the municipality that we collaborated with busted as a result of mismanagement, basically. And the site was one of the things that we're really keen on seeing going. They really made an effort to really try and allow the work to continue, precisely because it has become a place where they hope in the future they will be able to attract people to visit, and they already started doing it. And every year we host open days where we have activities running with local schools and everything. But apart from that, really you can see when they come, and they keep coming every year. And now I know them all basically. And I wonder and ask them, but why are you coming here? You're basically saying something that is basically what you heard last year. Because to be retold that story that they feel in some ways part of is for them so important. So it has had a huge, huge impact. Now, local teachers are including sections about the local history that previously they did not, because they didn't care. The people feel like they have a longer history, but also is a history that we tell about, a very interconnected world. These people, the inhabitants, came from other parts of Italy, and for the kind of diverse communities that even a little municipality like the one we collaborate with, we were talking about 2,000 people, even there, the world has changed for them. And that provides a kind of nice grounding for all the people of the community to come together and realize that, we all come from somewhere else in many respects.
That's great. So a couple of questions, a bit more specific. So is there any record of what became of the town and when? I mean, when do we think there was the end of, there's still occupation there now, but when did the Roman town fall away? And do we have any kind of indication other than just when the archaeology stops?
Okay, so basically the answer is no. It is only archaeology that really provides us with a terminus that is primarily provided by potsherds and coinage. So we know that the town was probably abandoned as such at the time of the Greco-Gothic War. So we are in the basically middle of the 6th century BC, and immediately, and probably that is the beginning of the real crisis. And then by the time of the Lombard invasion, the town has become a kind of abandoned site. And what they did is that they came back and they started taking apart all their houses, reusing the tiles and whatever. So basically it was taken down, literally, as they moved away from the center of the valley. We are in the problem with Interamna, which was its great advantage throughout history, was that it was in the center of the valley. So it was along a major road connected to the river. That is great when trade is what you want to intercept. But when this becomes also the route for marauding armies, invasions and whatever, you want to stay away as much as you can. So as this became a battlefield, basically, this part of Italy, and especially when people landed along the coast, but rather than going along the coast, which at that point had become marshy and malaric, they rather go through this valley, which today is, if anyone is driven south of Rome, that is where you drive through. It's a natural corridor connecting Rome with southern Italy. So all these armies passing by, these people realized that, no, this is not the right spot to find yourself in. So we know from archaeology when it was abandoned, but it disappears from our texts, basically from the, well, if you include the inscriptions, and you don't consider that really archaeology, then we know that the site was occupied at least in 410 AD, my apologies. But if you're talking about literary texts, authors, I think the last testimony is Pliny, really, in the 1st century AD.
And then some people in the chat are really interested in the kind of technology that you were talking about early on. And so could you give us a kind of, for me at least, a kind of idiot's guide to the difference between magnetometry and the ground penetrating radar that you're using?
Okay.
And what they show and why you need both, for example.
The principles of the application of geophysics in any in archaeology specifically, but that applies anywhere, is that basically what is in the subsoil, will feature specific physical qualities that will make stand out from the soil that surrounds it. Okay, because a wall in the middle of a clay layer will, of course, you can imagine by itself as different physical qualities. Now, the different techniques that we apply work better at capturing, detecting some of these qualities rather than others. So basically, when it comes to magnetometry, which is the one that is done with a strange kind of antenna, which is a gradiometer. It looks like an H. What it does is that it's a very, 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 very refined metal detector in many respects. If we were to find metal, it would go, well, it wouldn't blow up, but it would give a readings that it is off the scale. But basically, a brick that is clay that has been exposed to very high temperature will feature, even after 2,000 years, a magnetic signature that is very different from clay that has not been exposed to that level of heat. So given that they were using a lot of tiles, a lot of building materials made up from ceramic, from terracotta, that shows up as an anomaly. So what happens is that the person will go up and down the field, scanning it, like one of our scanners, basically, at home, but little, but over 25 hectares, it took us 2 years to do it, as you can imagine. And we can plot where the signals say there is something weird here. And we plot in a way, identify there are some lines and regular feature that once you put them together, acquire the form of a Roman building. At Interamna, it worked and it didn't work. It was good at picking up the layout of roads for whatever reason, but not that much the layout of buildings. And there are reasons for this. They're probably out to be explained to the nature of the soil. Its density is very hard clay, and the tool, the instrument, may not be that good at picking it up. So if I were to show you the image that the magnetometry produced, you will see a kind of gray area with some darker lines you would recognize as the roads, but something in the center of these roads, the insula of the Roman town, where you cannot see. Well, you can see bits and pieces, but nothing that has a proper shape. That is why we brought the georadar, that in other contexts didn't work. So the reason why we collaborated with our colleagues from Ghent, they were working on another side, on the Adriatic side of Italy, so further to the east, in Potenza Picena. And they had acquired this wonderful kit, which simply didn't work. They couldn't see anything, and they were quite desperate to, find a good site where they could try it out. So we were friends, and we said, "Oh, why don't you come along?" And we tried it, and this is where the this specific kit was able to detect what was buried in higher detail. How does the georadar work? Basically, it is a set of antennas. Basically there are emitters, things that basically cast a signal in the ground. And then there are antennas that are receiving when it bounces back, because every time the signal passes through a layer, so basically if you imagine that there's my jumper here is a layer, part of the signal will go back. So the further you go down, the signal attenuates, becomes weaker and weaker, but every time it comes across a different layer, so a change in the density of the medium and so on, it will send this kind of anomaly signal. If you connect it with a GPS, and the GPS we use is accurate to the centimeter, so quite precise, you can plot the plan of, but you can plot what you have there. The main difference between these two technologies is that the magnetometry tells me only if there is an anomaly in a point within X, Y coordinates. The georadar can give me the depth. It tells me, okay, the anomaly is at this point on the X, on the Y, and also on the Z. And that is very important because it allows me also to see how much of it is preserved, how deep it goes, and all of a sudden I start having a kind of three-dimensional picture of what is buried. Both have their weaknesses and their strengths. Magnetometry is quicker, faster, cheaper, and is good as a standard entry into a geophysical survey of any site. Georadar, even though the one we use, developed by our colleagues in Ghent, is quite elaborate, is towed by a quad. It's pretty cool, actually, and allows to cover more ground than would have been the case even 15 years ago. It's still more expensive, and it requires more time.
Thanks. And then a question perhaps for the students, I suppose, which is whether you could say something about was this perhaps Alfred especially, was this your first sort of archaeological experience? Had you been on digs before? What was it like? I mean, something's got you hooked clearly, so maybe you could say something about, because as I understand it, being on a dig and being in, working closely with people on those kinds of things is a really kind of fun but very, very demanding experience.
Well, this is actually, I've been to Interamna twice now, and I've been to 2 digs before that, so I've sort of been hooked on it for a while. But every dig site's sort of very different, and it's sort of very much made by the people you dig with. Yes, and so Interamna's been sort of a really fun, great experience. I think everyone's really enjoyed it.
Well, it does sound, I mean, you see these programs of poor people digging on Orkney or something, and you think, well, I think I'd rather be somewhere a bit more southern than that.
But when it's kind of up of 30 degrees.
Yeah, I was about to say that when it's 43 degrees.
Yeah, there are limits. Yes. Yeah. I can see that. Yeah. And so, Alfred, what got you into coins, especially? I mean, why coins? Why is that the kind of aspect that you've kind of decided to develop those kinds of conservation and skills with?
Well, I think a lot of people sort of avoid looking at coins because they think it involves a lot of specialist knowledge, but actually you can learn a lot very quickly. And it's something I've sort of been interested in for a very long time. I used to do metal detecting in sort of my urge to do archaeology before I could go on formal digs. I found lots of coins and wanted to identify them. So I've sort of found I was very naturally able to identify the coins being pulled out of the ground at Interamna. And then just sort of finding interesting questions about them that sort of naturally emerged. Yeah.
Excellent. So good. Someone's asking what happens now. I mean, are you presumably you're going back? What's there to do? What's there new to do? And what would you really like to find next?
The early phases of the settlement, because everything that, there is a problem with all Roman towns generally, that is in the time of the first emperor Augustus, all this town explodes. They need to show that they are wealthy, that, these are good times. There is a lot of investment, a lot of opportunities. So what happens often is that you dig down and you reach a layer that is associated with building phases of the Augustan period underneath earlier phases that you cannot perhaps reach unless you kind of cut a hole into a floor or something like that. Now, luckily for us, if you like, there are some areas at the side that allow us this kind of windows. So we have identified there are documented early phases of occupation for a time of the town that we know less well than everything that comes in the imperial period. So this summer, when we go back, we will be digging around a building that, if I can show on the PowerPoint, I think I can illustrate that better. So basically, we will be digging around here. Why there? Because the keen-eyed of you may have noticed that there are these weird features. Now, what happened is that there was a Republican porticus, so like of a colonnade that was raised completely in order to make room for the theater. Now, we identified it, we excavated part of it, and we dated it to the earliest part of the 2nd century BC. But actually, that was a very cautious dating because it could have been even earlier than that, even kind of late 3rd. That may sound like making not much of a difference, but in fact, it's fundamental. I can explain why. Because there is this assumption that what happens in Italy in the Republican period is always a reflection of what happens in Rome. That is, things arrive in Rome, and from there they spread. But that doesn't quite capture the relationships, and network is a word that we used a lot today, but the nature of the relationship between Rome and all the other settlements. These were allies. And, when they were going into the Eastern Mediterranean to make their conquest, when they were fighting with the Carthaginian before, they were doing it as allies. And the allies have really accounted for more of the army than the Romans. And the inhabitants of Interamna were not technically Romans. They were allies. They may have originated in Rome, but when they established the colony, they became citizens of this place, not Rome anymore. Now, these people took opportunities as much as people in Rome, and may have brought home ideas, not only at the same time as Rome, but maybe slightly earlier than that, as would be the case in a site nearby along the coast, where we see that basically they start having the kind of Greek-inspired architecture before you find those buildings in Rome. So the reason why we've been so cautious about the dating of this building is that we don't want to, annoy some of my colleagues in Italy and say, well, because, there is a well-eradicated idea that no, things need to pass through Rome first. But recent scholarship really has questioned that. So that is the great thing about this site that may allow us to answer that. It provides us with occupation over a very long period. For us, it's a mine of information. It's a site that has never been excavated before, which is rare for a town in Italy, as you would expect. Even any Roman town that I know about, at some point, some antiquarian, would have gone there with a shovel, or, some excavation would have taken place. Never here, never ever, because they all basically thought that it sucked, that it was not worth their time. So what we have is a perfectly preserved site with a very long life that was very well connected, not too special as to be unrepresentative, but it allows us, therefore, to answer all sorts of interesting questions. And we started with the imperial and late antique period as our first point of reference. And we saw that there was no decline, as people assumed before, there is much more continuity, and blah, blah, blah. Now we want to go to the earlier phases to see actually whether that allows us with a window into the Republican phases, not just of Interamna, but of Interamna as representative of Roman Italy.
That's great. And then perhaps finally on that wonderful sundial. I think you mentioned when you were presenting it that it's relatively unusual to find a sundial with the dedicator's name attached. Is that right? I wonder whether you think, is that just a matter of preservation, or was this an unusual thing for someone to dedicate?
I think there are perhaps two aspects here. One is that at the face of a sundial, these ones are probably the best to have an inscription on them, but often the kind of space to where you could put an inscription on the sundial is quite small. So you could expect that if there were inscriptions, which you would expect there to be if someone was benefacting it and making the effort to pay for it, why not stick your name somewhere? It might be on a separate inscription. So on that sundial, for example, that we see outside the Temple of Apollo at Pompeii, that some people might have seen on their travels and that I put on my PowerPoint, the inscription for that is actually lower on the column. So you can imagine that being one aspect. In terms of the people doing the dedicating, if we kind of zoom out and look a little bit wider than Italy and include Italy as well, the kinds of people we see are usually people with a bit more money. So we get a lot of magistrates and we actually get an emperor as well, which is quite exciting. So I think that in terms of how common it was to donate these kinds of objects, you can imagine that this is a little bit of a quirky choice. So you want to set yourself apart. A sundial is the kind of thing that a square needs one of them. It doesn't need 10, whereas you could put up 10 statues. You could throw multiple public feasts. So this was a very quirky and interesting choice that I think was meant to set you apart. And as we kind of finished with the Petronius point, was really very clever and memorable in terms of advertisement. And if we can go down another road and think about the sun as linked to the emperor's power and that kind of thing. But regardless, I think of whether you accept that or not, it's definitely something that's memorable to have your name on.
And finally,
if I may add just one thing to give a sense of the scale here, there are about 600, there is a database of about 600 sundials known from antiquity. Of these, 30 are inscribed. I think less than half of them bear the name of the person who dedicated it.
And finally, just very finally, the Petronius quote from, that's Trimalchio, is it, saying do this? Is that a joke? Because if he's telling them to put a sundial in the middle of his tomb, is the idea that, I mean, it's going to be enclosed, so there's no sun going to hit it? I mean, that's just the kind of Petronius mocking Trimalchio, is it? Okay, right. I'm glad I got that. Good. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. That's the last of our webinars for this term. Next term, we will have the session that was unfortunately postponed from last month, where we'll have some members of the faculty joining us to talk about new directions in research into late antiquity. But I would just like to mention the faculty does all of this kind of work, often with grants and so on from external supporters, but we also often have to rely upon support from our alumni and so on, who often help us in allowing students to participate in these kinds of excavations and this kind of work. And I hope you've seen the kind of excellent work that the students are producing and the kind of training that we're able to provide to generate the archaeologists for the next generation. Anyway, thanks for joining us again. We hope to see you next term for more of our alumni webinars. Thank you again to everyone on the panel.
Thank you very much.